My Lords, the hybrid sitting of the House will now resume, and I ask members to respect social distancing. Private notice question, Official Development Assistant Lord Purvis of Tweed.
I beg leave to move the question which I give in private notice that's on the order paper.
Ahmad of Wimbledon.
My Lords, the Government is committed to returning to spending 0.7% of GNI on official development assistance when the fiscal situation allows. The 2015 Act envisages situations in which departure from the target may be necessary and provides for the Secretary of State's accountability to Parliament through the requirement to lay a statement before Parliament and, if relevant, make reference to economic and fiscal circumstances. The Foreign Secretary has already committed to doing that.
My Lords, the Minister had said that the Government would bring legislation forward to amend the Act that I took through this place, and then they've said that they wouldn't. The Government has said that they would give out more information on the fiscal conditions for restoration, but it hasn't. It has said it would publish reports and impact assessments, and we are yet to see them. Claims that setting a different and lesser target of 0.5% is in line with the Act are false. Assertions the law allows for proactive changes to the duty to meet 0.7% are wrong, and there is no provision in the Act to do that. I have been patient over the last 6 months. I sometimes think too patient. The Minister responsible for these cuts disagrees with me as the member in charge of the Act that took it through. What is the problem with us both allowing Parliament to decide on this?
And equally, on various questions that the Noble Lord has asked me, I retain the fact that the Government remains very steadfast. It recognises its obligations under law and also its obligations to your Lordship's House.
Collins of Highbury.
Well, my Lords, the Noble Lord the Minister repeated the mantra that we've heard many times, that we intend to return to spending 0.7% of our national income on international development when the fiscal situation allows. So, what specific circumstances will have to be met for the Government to return to 0.7%? Why is it taking 6 months to define? Give us an answer today.
My Lords, what I say to the Noble Lord is, and I think he should recognise this, and I'm sure he does, we've been faced with the worst economic contraction, as I've said repeatedly, for almost 300 years, and a budget deficit of close to £400 billion. It is therefore right that we take time to understand fully what the long-term impact of our financial positions will be. And as the Chief Secretary to the Treasury this week has made clear, we've had to look at a range of fiscal measures, including our situation on debt and borrowing. Last year we borrowed over £300 billion, and this year we're forecast to borrow a further £234 billion. So therefore we will provide details as we move forward, but I'm sure the Noble Lord reflects we are facing very challenging times. Notwithstanding that, we are still amongst the largest when it comes to development support across the globe.
Lord Judge.
My Lords, I draw attention to the fact that I have a daughter who works in overseas development, but my question is not directed to the merits or demerits of the Government proposal. But my question is this, really following up Lord Purvis of Tweed. How is it consistent with the sovereignty of Parliament, which is, after all, the preeminent constitutional principle which all of us in this chamber embrace? How is it consistent with the sovereignty of Parliament for an unequivocal statutory obligation on the Executive to be postponed without further reference to Parliament except a mere ministerial statement? At least with Henry VIII provisions, we do have a fig leaf, a notional fig leaf, that there's parliamentary consent. But this is executive reliance on Section 3 of the Act, and it removes that fig leaf. And isn't the sight rather unpleasant?
Yeah.
My Lords, when I saw the Noble and Learned Lord's name on the Speaker's list, I was immediately, the Henry VIII element had come into my mind from previous times of taking legislation through. The Noble Lord makes a pertinent point in terms of legislation, but let me assure the Noble and Learned Lord, we are looking quite specifically at our obligations under the Act and, of course, taking advice in this respect. And I'm sure in due course we'll be able to provide further detail as to the return to 0.7%.
Lord Bates.
My Lords, British taxpayers can take immense pride in the fact that their funds have helped save the lives of over 1 million people in the last 5 years alone, most of those children. The fact, therefore, that this budget is now being reduced is going to mean tens or hundreds of thousands of lives that are going to be lost. It is a life and death issue, and I know that my noble friend cares as much as any of the rest of us about the consequences of these difficult decisions which need to be taken. Can I mention just one? In recording my interest as co-chair of the all-party group on WASH, over 50 million people have depended on UK aid for clean water and sanitation, crucial at the current time with COVID pandemic as well. Would my noble friend agree that it would be inappropriate if WASH programmes were disproportionately impacted by the overall reductions in the aid budget?
My Lords, may I firstly recognise the important role that my noble friend has played and continues to play on the development scene, and in particular on a specific number of programmes, and particularly as his role as the co-chair of the APPG on WASH. I know from directly visiting projects in the field the importance of the WASH programmes, and that's, as I'm sure my noble friend recognises, is why we're working and continuing to work with the likes of Unilever. We're also working with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and I can assure my noble friend I'm working directly, notwithstanding the challenging reductions we've had to make, with all key agencies of the UN to see how we can optimise the work of multilateral organisations through the UN, and indeed complement them through our bilateral programmes in country, of which the WASH programmes provide a very good example of what can be sustained, retained, and indeed prevention when it comes to the spread, as we've seen through the pandemic, of the WASH programmes of further diseases and viruses.
My Lords, exactly how is the government respecting either the law or this House in the way that he said in answer to my noble friend? And he knows that the Act allows a reduction in aid spending if the economy contracts. But the government has gone beyond that. He knows that. So why do they fear bringing this back to Parliament? He knows the impact on lives, and he's just heard an example of that. Does he really think that the British public, when we know of their generosity to comic relief, really think this is the right thing to do? So who ordered that there would be no impact assessments of these cuts, and why?
Lords, first of all, we fully understand the implication of the challenging decisions we've made, and I've already alluded to them not just today but previously. I recognise that, but I'm sure the noble lady also recognises that we do and continue to spend a large proportion of our budget on overseas development aid as compared to other, including G7 members. Undoubtedly, yes, the reduction, which is a temporary reduction, has been made, which has had an impact on programmes that we're doing both through multilateral agencies and in country. On the issue of impact assessments, as I said in a question earlier today, we have done inequalities impact assessment in terms of understanding important issues of our programmes, particularly relating to, for example, girls' education. And as I said in response to a question earlier, we are currently considering the publication of that very quality impact assessment.
So,
My Lords, I deeply regret that the government was not able to compromise with what is clearly the will of the democratically elected other place, and I hope that they are reflecting carefully on Mr Speaker's words about an effective and meaningful vote, as this issue is not going away. One of the consequences of the aid cuts and the ceiling of 0.5% is the limits that it places on our response to COVID-19. For example, we have not been able to make a contribution to COVAX since the cuts were announced. I really welcome the Prime Minister's focus on global vaccinations at this weekend's G7 summit, but can my noble friend the Minister tell me if any UK donations will be over and above 0.5%, or will there have to be further cuts to UK aid to pay for them?
My Lords, on the issue of the reductions that we've made in relation to the 0.5%, as my noble friend will know, this was a reduction that was done on a one-year settlement, and certainly as a minister responsible for multilateral agencies, as a number of country projects, where development assistance plays an important role. We are now working very much with country partners on the basis of the budgets agreed. On the issue of the COVAX contribution, we stand by the over £500 million we've made to the COVAX facility, and I know my right honourable friend the Prime Minister is looking to see further announcements that may be made in the aftermath of the G7 meeting.
The Lord Bishop of Worcester.
My Lords, I want first of all to salute the commitment of the Noble Lord the Minister to development, which is much appreciated. But I was disappointed to hear him say again that we are among the largest givers, remain among the largest givers in G7. Surely that's not the point. The point is that a manifesto commitment, one of which the Conservative Party, to my mind, could be very proud, has been broken. And the argument marshalled for that breaking of a promise is the fiscal situation, but it's surely a matter of priorities. The eye-watering amounts of money have been spent on other things, and this is a really relatively small part of UK expenditure. Furthermore, it's surely in our own interest. Jesus tells us to love our neighbour as ourselves. The implication is that by loving our neighbour, we will actually love ourselves better. And at the moment, we need to commit surely more to overseas aid and fighting this terrible pandemic, which is global, as we all know, not just confined to this country, but other countries are suffering much worse. So surely this matter should be debated by Parliament very soon.
On the Right Reverend Prelate's final point, of course, and the debates, as has been demonstrated today, continue, and I fully expect that as the Minister responsible for the business of the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, we will be returning to this matter again. However, what I would say to the Right Reverend Prelate, I appreciate, and as a person of faith myself, I recognise the important, and it's right, the role that development assistance has played around the world in standing up for the most vulnerable, in providing people for an opportunity to better their lives. That remains a key priority for this government. We have had to make some challenging decisions over the last year because of the domestic situation, and I'm sure the Right Reverend Prelate recognises the increased level of support that we've given citizens across the UK. Nevertheless, the government remains resolute, the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary and indeed the Chancellor, that we will return to the 0.7% at the earliest opportunity as the surrounding economic situation thus allows for.
Baroness Hayman.
My Lords, I declare my interests as set out in the register. I believe that the Noble Lord the Minister, in response to my noble friend Lord Judge, said that the Department was taking legal advice. I wonder if he could give a little more detail on that. And does it reflect a view within the department that it is quite possible that the Noble Lord, Lord Purvis, is correct and that what the executive is doing is in fact illegal? And given that, and given the strength of feeling on this issue, not least from every living ex-Prime Minister, doesn't the government really need to respect Parliament and to give Parliament a meaningful vote on this issue?
My Lords, I can't agree with the premise of what the Noble Lady is suggesting. What I can say to her is reiterating the point, and of course the government takes legal advice on a range of issues to ensure that our obligations both under the law and our obligations to Parliament are being met. And as I've said on a number of occasions, and I repeat again, that we are fully cognizant of our obligations on both those fronts.
Baroness Sheehan.
My Lords, may I ask the Minister, how will the plethora of cut programmes be reinstated once the temporary cuts to the aid budget is restored, or are they lost in perpetuity?
My Lord, the Noble Lady asks a very practical question, and it's right to do so. And I assure her in the approach we've been taking, and I can share this with her quite directly, is looking at the very core of projects to ensure that the equities we have on the ground, both with multilateral partners but also with key partners in delivery, are sustained to allow for the ability to scale up as and when the circumstances allow.
My Lords, Britain will be contributing £10 billion this year to the European Union, roughly the same sum that the government is proposing to spend on overseas aid. Could my noble friend give me an undertaking that if there is to be a vote in your Lordship's House on the overseas aid budget, it could be accompanied by a vote on our contributions to the European Union so that priorities for our overseas disbursements could be considered in the round?
My noble friend presents an interesting proposition. What I would say to him is response that as part of the withdrawal agreement, which was ratified back in January 2020, a financial settlement was agreed on the UK's past obligations as a member of and a departing member state from the EU, and by definition it follows that it does not relate to any future arrangements, and both the EU and the UK recognise our financial commitments to each other in this respect.
Lord Alton.
My Lords, can I take the Noble Lord the Minister back to questions of parliamentary sovereignty, legality and trust? If governments are permitted to break laws, politicians to break manifesto promises, parliamentarians to break commitments to the destitute and starving, why should anyone take the blindest bit of notice when the United Kingdom proclaims the rule of law and the primacy of Parliament? My Lords, before the Prime Minister travels to the G7 summit, will the Noble Lord the Minister please take a message, the one he's heard today during these exchanges, but from many of the members of your Lordship's House, that this country's word should be its bond, even when it's difficult or inconvenient, and to urgently put right this deeply troubling and arguably illegal decision?
My Lord's noble Lord is fully aware of. I respect greatly his commitment, his passion, and of course his principle when it comes to issues of our support of the most vulnerable communities around the world, his advocacy for human rights around the world as well. On a lighter note, if I may, he suggests that I should talk to the Prime Minister before he departs for the G7. The Prime Minister is already in Cornwall, so I will certainly, on that, I can't promise that I'll be able to do that in all practical terms. But I would say to the Noble Lord, I think I recognise, as I've said before, and as does the government, the important role that Parliament plays, its sovereignty, the importance to stand up for the rule of law. It's indeed, I'm responsible as the Minister standing up for the rule of law, and I can assure the Noble Lord that in my engagement directly, as was demonstrated in our support for recent candidatures that we've had to International Criminal Court, for example, that demonstrated the strength and respect for the United Kingdom as a state that stands up for its international obligations and for the international rule of law, and long may that continue.
My Lords, the time allowed for this private notice question has now elapsed.